All right, we are already in study number 4 of the book of Ezekiel. We began with a basic introduction, and now we're taking a look at the chapters, and we're not going one chapter a week because then it would take us 30 some weeks to do this. But we're looking at different sub-themes and sections that we find here in the book. And tonight we're going to look at a section that has some very bizarre behavior by Ezekiel. And we're going to try to make some sense of four signs that Ezekiel is giving to his people. So we're going to begin with a couple of introductory things here. First of all, I want to remind you that chapters 1 through 11 begins with the vision of chapter 1, where Ezekiel sees the presence of God. And then what we find is that as you then kind of turn the corner from this vision, what you have then in chapters 4 and 5 is a warning. And it's embodied in signs that Ezekiel is giving. And they are really strange. And then what we'll find later is when we take another turn into chapter 12, then we're going to find various oracles and arguments that he's going to give. And then the book kind of closes off with some promises and restoration for Israel. So these are the verses we're going to take a look at, beginning in chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 17. Here's what I want you to look for tonight as we take a look at these four specific actions of Ezekiel. Number one, prophets deliver their message more than words. A lot of times they do so through kind of street theater. And when you look at these particular signs, the action becomes the medium. Secondly, Ezekiel, I think, is symbolically bearing the guilt of the people. He's kind of mirroring the scapegoat chapter of Leviticus chapter 16. Number three, part of the prophetic calling of Jesus' followers is these periodic and intentional actions of self-denial that's going to bear witness to the brokenness of the world around them. And then finally, number four, chapter 4 begins more of the judicial section of Ezekiel. This sounds accusatory, and what we find is he's stacking up evidence along the way, all the way through chapter 11. So kind of keep your eyes open for that. So here are the four sign acts that are taking place in chapters 4 and 5. So I put a picture up here just as a way of kind of showing how street theater works. So here's a guy that's crouching down in the middle of the street, and he's just covering his eyes. And as he sits there, one of the things that it's communicating could be a number of things that the noise, as it's subtitled there, is overwhelming. Could be communicating that he's getting in the way of something, blocking something in the middle of the street, and so forth. So here are the four specific actions of Ezekiel. He builds a brick city. Number two, he lays down on his side for a substantial period of time. Number three, he eats some bread that has been baked over poop. And then number four, he shaves his head and his beard. And all four of these actions are intending to communicate symbolically something to the nation of Israel. So let's ask the question here about these sign acts. It's not unusual to Ezekiel. You have just entered the weird and wonderful world of prophetic communication. So if you were to read all the prophets, you're going to find, especially in the big three, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, that they all do some things that seem to be out of touch. And they seem to do things that would cause other people observing them to question their sanity. And sometimes these are the type of people that we're afraid of when they're doing random types of actions that doesn't seem to make any sense. But when it's placed in context, it's carrying a very specific message. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 19, he takes some jars and he smashes them as a way of illustrating what's coming. In Isaiah chapter 20, verse 2, Isaiah strips down, and the text says that he is naked, walking around the city for everybody to observe. And scholars have calculated by the time he's told to put his clothes back on, that 3 years have elapsed. So, really, some very strange things. Now, these are not random acts of psychosis by these individuals. They are very specific nonverbal elements of their message. They're acting out their message in a demonstrative way. And that's why they are designated within theological circles as some of the sign acts of the major prophets. So we need to ask the question, what is a sign act? This comes out of Freeble's Dictionary of the Old Testament Prophets. He says, sign acts are nonverbal actions and objects intentionally employed by the prophets so that the message content is communicated through these actions and objects to the audience. So maybe the best way to think of it is as a visual aid. So a lot of times, pastors and teachers will use something to illustrate something else. And it could be anything, really. In the case of the prophets here, it's some specific coordinated body movements, facial expressions, and complex actions that are making their point. Many times we play it safe in some of our visual aids. We might bring in a jar that has something in it to illustrate something, or we might put something up on the whiteboard or something on the overhead, that type of thing. Now, there's an important distinction here. And the distinction here is this is not the same as signs and wonders. When a prophet performs a sign or wonder, these are miracles. So, like when Elijah raises the little boy from the dead. Of course, splitting the Red Sea when Moses holds up the staff and the people go through the sea unharmed. Those are miracles. They are also signs, but they're miracles. When we're talking about sign acts, we're talking really about things that anyone could do. We could all walk around naked for 3 years. I don't know if we would get arrested or not, but the point is, the things that Ezekiel is doing here in this section, anyone could do if they wanted to do it. They're not miracles, but they are communicating a message. So there's really kind of two components to sign acts. Number one is the divine command. They don't invent some of these things themselves. They're told to do it by God. Then number two is how to interpret it. What does it mean? When they do these acts, what is it communicating to the people that are observing it? Now, some of the ways to observe sign acts when you're reading the scripture is to look for a description. So we're going to get some of this here, especially in the first sign act in chapter 4. God tells Ezekiel to draw a picture of the city of Jerusalem on a brick. Put the brick in the middle and build some things around it. But then he explains that that is going to symbolize the invasion of Babylon to Jerusalem. And he gives a description of the performance that Ezekiel is doing and giving rationale to it. Sometimes when you look for sign acts as you read them, words that are used as similes, words like or as, are often attached to it, illustrating that it's supposed to represent something else. So that's kind of a way to look for it. Or you could just wait for your pastor or your teacher to tell you this is a sign act. So, all right. So let's dive into it. So here's the first one. in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now, son of man," or as I was using the Jerusalem Bible translation last week, this is the NIV. This is also translated mortal. Now, mortal, as in not God, but human. Now, son of man, take a clay tablet, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then lay siege to it, erect siege works against it, build a ramp up to it, set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it. Then take an iron pan, place it as an iron between you and the city, and turn your face toward it. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign to the house of Israel. Now, we're going to take a look in a second here that the scriptures tell us that that's what Nebuchadnezzar is going to do. Now, he's already done it once. Remember, Ezekiel is living between the two invasions of Nebuchadnezzar into the city of Jerusalem. One of them has already happened. That's why he's by the Kebar River. He's been taken into exile. But the second one has not happened yet, when Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in and he is going to destroy the city. Now, there's three things to this to look for. Number one, so he is told to take a brick. Now, here's an illustration of a brick, and it's a pretty fancy drawing on it because you can do it with graphic arts. But when you're working with a clay brick and you have a stick, it would be pretty rough looking. However, the word brick is important here because the first time we are introduced to the bricks that are being made, long before they're to build the Egyptian cities with bricks that they make, we're introduced to it in Genesis chapter 3 when people are making bricks to build the Tower of Babel. And what they want to do is they want to build this ziggurat and get close to the heavens and make a name for themselves. Well, this idea of brick building goes all the way back to the beginning of the Old Testament, and you find it several places on up to the time of Ezekiel. The most important is the amount of bricks that need to be made by the Jewish people while they're in captivity for 400 years. Now, there's a corollary there. Maybe one reason this brick is a sign act is it takes the people back to those moments in time when they were in exile before in 400 years. And now it's being reiterated again by Ezekiel drawing the city of Jerusalem, now built up, now the centerpiece of the country, the capital, that type of thing. And yet it's on a brick. So very subtly, there's a message being given. What has happened before is going to happen again. Number two, the scene is really symbolizing the siege of Jerusalem that we're told about in Second Kings. So I'm going to keep my thumb here and go to Second Kings, and I want to just read for you the description that is told in the historical section um, of our Old Testament. Now, the fall of Jerusalem is specifically portrayed in chapter 25 of Second Kings, and I'll read it for you here. We're told of a king by the name of Zedekiah, who is the king of Judah, and he's been reigning 11 years. And then we are told that the Lord's anger in verse 20 of chapter 24 is some things are going to happen to Jerusalem and Judah. It says, because of the Lord's anger, that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end, he thrust them from his presence. So this is part of divine judgment. Well, what is it? Well, human action comes into play here. It says, now Zedekiah, who's the king, rebelled against the king of Babylon. Well, why did he do that? Well, he is trying to build an alliance with others because he does not want to be under the thumb of Nebuchadnezzar.
So it says in verse 1 of chapter 25, so in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. There you go. That's the exact same phrase that is mentioned in Ezekiel. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Now, one of the sign acts is to bake bread, but over poop. Okay? Keep this in your mind. That's another cross reference here. It says, then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. And he was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. So this first sign act, in many ways, has been foretold already in the historical books. Now, remember, in the book of Ezekiel, you have components that are put together over a course of time. And it really does take some very sophisticated scholarship to break down how this whole book came together. But what we find taking place here is the cross reference and the connection back to the historical reference. Third, the iron wall seems to symbolize the separation between God and his people. It's as if there's this separation that has taken place between God and the people because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant. So I was trying to think a little bit of how you could visualize this. So um, first, before I show that to you, I have another. Well, I'll come back to this. Okay. So take a look at that. If you put all the components of this sign act together, it might look something like this, where you have the brick, you have the model of Jerusalem drawn on it, and then you have these different elements that are posted around it, and he has some type of piece of iron between his body and the model. Or we might call it a diorama. So it's trying to show what's coming next. And in all of this, what we find is the overwhelming force of the Babylonian army as they invade the city is basically going to destroy the city and is going to destroy the temple as well. The use of this iron object seems to highlight the impenetrability of the barrier. There's no way these people can escape. So when you go back to 2 Kings chapter 25, the people were surrounded and they couldn't get out and they were starving to death. And finally, the Babylonians broke through the wall. So now I've come back to the picture here. So I found this online of an artist's rendition of what this might look like. But I want you to go back to your childhood for a minute, and I want you to, at least in my childhood, when I was growing up, these little plastic toy soldiers and cowboys and Indians that came in a plastic bag and there's 100 pieces in them were quite popular toys. And you might find, like this picture here, you would play for hours, kind of pretending of various battles that could take place. And if you were playing with a friend, they would take a certain color of those plastic soldiers and you take the others. And then it got real sophisticated. You remember they put out plastic tanks and boats and all those type of things. That's a good similarity, what's taking place here. It's almost as if Ezekiel is acting out the coming devastation that the Babylonian army is going to bring. Okay, let me stop there and see if you have any questions or comments on this first sign. All right, number 2. Now, this is a weird one because it involves a specific amount of time, as you'll see. So in verses 4 through 8, sign act number 2. Then lie on your left side and put the sin of the house of Israel upon yourself. Now, it's no longer between the model and his body. Now it's laying on his body. You are to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side. So when I was telling you what to look for, this is very similar to the sins of the people being confessed over the scapegoat in Leviticus chapter 16. And it seems as though Ezekiel is bearing the sin of these people as he lays on his side. Now look at how long this is. Verse 5. I have assigned you the same number of days as the years of their sin. Now we're told, we're given an explanation of what this means. He's not just laying on his side for the heck of it. It's to represent specifically a length of time that the Israelites had been in rebellion to the covenant. So how long is that? So for 390 days, you will bear the sin of the house of Israel over a year's time, lying on his left side. Verse 6. And after you have finished this, lie down again. You're allowed to roll over, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the house of Judah. Now, there's a distinction being made here between Israel and Judah. Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, Judah, the 2 tribes to the south. But this one, it says, I have assigned you 40 days, a day for each year. Turn your face toward the siege of Jerusalem, and with bared arm prophesy against her. Now, 390 years plus 40 more days are symbolic. So the first thing to notice is probably the Day of Atonement, bearing the collective sin of Israel's apostasy. 390 years could possibly be about the period of time, as you can see there on the second point, for the 12 tribes and the entire period of time that, of the temple's existence. So if you did the calculations, the temple was built somewhere 970 BCE to 960 BCE. You can look at that in 1 Kings chapter 6 or 8. And then the violation of their unfaithfulness over all this time. They're going through the motions. They're offering up their sacrifices, but they're not doing the most crucial part of the covenant, and that is being a faithful people of justice. So all of this is representing a judgment that is coming because of their unfaithfulness. Now, the 40 years is represented in the 40 days could be simply an overlap of the previous thing. Scholars really are at a conundrum trying to figure out how to do the calculations here. It could be, as you can see on the screen, 390 years resulting in a period of 430 years when you add them together, which some scholars say takes you back to the period of David rather than the temple. So we don't know. But what we do know is it represents something, and it represents a judgment that's coming. Maybe the 40 years represents a generation of time, just like when the people wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. The previous generation could not enter into the promised land, then the next generation could. Do what you want with that. I mean, scholars really are not real sure how to calculate it exactly. Okay, now here's the key question. Did he really lay on his side for more than a year? Okay. Did he lay there 24 hours a day for over a year? When you read here, um, you're one of the things that you're noticing is that it is representing something else. So some scholars think that the idea of bearing the punishment is something that he did at periods of time every day, not necessarily 24 hours a day, because he's also tied up. Take a look at verse 8. It says, I will tie you up with ropes so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have finished the days of your siege. So somebody else was involved in this process too that would tie him up on a daily basis. Scholars think that maybe what's happening here is that he would go out for a period of time, unknown period of time, each day, lie on his left side. He would go back to his home at night and do the same thing again the next day. Even that repetition would catch notice. Why is this guy out here every day for over a year doing this? Okay. We're told that Ezekiel is bearing their punishment symbolically. It's not that he is an atonement of some sort for them, but there is going to be no temple where they can offer up sacrifices while they're in exile. So there are other ways that they probably are representing the need for the Day of Atonement. And maybe this is representing over a year's time. Ezekiel is bearing the punishment of the people for either the worship of idols dramatically or possibly not adhering to the laws of justice that are laid down in the Mosaic covenant in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. This is an interesting phrase here as well. It says in verse 7, turn your face toward the siege of Jerusalem and with bared arm prophesy against her. There is a cross reference in Isaiah 52:10 about the bared arm implying God's saving action actually in that verse. But the bared arm might be representing God acting in a powerful way. Okay. Now, what we do know is the way that he's going to powerfully act against their unfaithfulness is by using the nation of Babylon. So, in our study on the chaos dragons on Sunday morning, we're coming this Sunday to talk about dragon nations and how God uses one nation sometimes to correct or chastise another nation. But that we'll come to that this Sunday in that study. Okay, so that's two signs. Any questions or comments that you have there? Okay, number 3. This is in verses 9 through 17. It says here, take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day and eat it at set times. Also measure out a sixth of hin water and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a barley cake. Bake it in the sight of the people using human excrement for fuel. The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations that I will drive them. Okay, so a couple of observations. Number one, barley was kind of a low quality grain. It really was used kind of by the lower economic classes as far as making their dinner and so forth. And that's what they had to eat, especially when they are encamped around by the Babylonian army and food gets scarce. They use only what they have available, but it's not real high quality. Secondly, the mode of baking here, using human excrement as fuel,
is an image of the besieged city as well. People can't go outside. They can't take out their garbage. They can't take out their refuse, that type of thing. And so they live among the refuse that their bodies are producing for a period of time while they are being invaded. Now, Ezekiel's going to protest this. Remember, he's a priest that has become a prophet. And it says here in verse 14, then I said, no, not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now, I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No unclean meat has ever entered my mouth. And then God um, acquiesces to that. It says, very well, he said, I will let you bake your bread over cow manure instead of human excrement. Now, that doesn't sound any better to us, does it? But in Ezekiel's mind, he is keeping the food laws of the Torah, and possibly what this could suggest is cow manure might have been a common source of fuel that was for fires, but not human excrement. So, in his protest, he wants to keep ritual purity. And so, God is going to say, okay, you can change your technique. And verse 16 then says, he said to me, Son of man, I will cut off the supply of food in Jerusalem. So there's the explanation as to what this represents. The people will eat rationed food in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair. Why? Because they're running out. They're running out of these resources. For food and water will be scarce. They will be appalled at the sight of each other and will waste away because of their sin. Naturally, they are going to lose a lot of weight and they're going to become skin and bones while they are trying to ride out this invasion from Babylon. So, sign number three has to do with the eating of a particular kind of bread that represents the coming siege and the famine that will follow. Number four, and this is the last one. He's going to chop off his hair and his beard. It says in verses 1 through 4. Now, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take a set of scales and divide up the hair. Interesting. Shaves off all his hair. Then he's going to divide it up into different parts. When the days of your siege come to an end, burn a third of the hair with fire inside the city. Take a third and strike it with the sword all around the city, and scatter a third to the wind. For I will pursue them with a drawn sword. But take a few strands of hair and tuck them away in the folds of your garment. This is going to represent the remnant that's going to come back to Jerusalem. Again, take a few of these and throw them into the fire and burn them up. A fire will spread from there to the whole house of Israel. In other words, most people are not going to have the privilege of coming back to their homeland. They'll either stay in Babylon or some of them will die because of what they experience and so forth. So, a couple of observations here. Priests were prohibited from shaving their beard and hair, which is a bit ironic that God tells him to do that, which would be in violation of Leviticus 21:5. But it's a sign of lamentation and mourning and bereavement. And you can see the cross references there in Isaiah 15 and Jeremiah 16, that it becomes a symbol, sort of like sackcloth and ashes. We know what that means. It kind of represents the sorrow of someone that has lost something. So he is defiling his priesthood by cutting his hair. And he is entering into a state of public mourning. And the weighing of the hair is interesting because it does have some Babylonian cross reference. In some of the Babylonian
texts. They're magical texts. There is reference to the importance of hair. Here, though, I think the idea um, is more symbolic than it is magical. It's just representing here, the hair represents the group of people. And some of it is divided up, and some things go into the fire. A little bit is tucked into the fold of his garment. So those are the four sign acts that are stacked on top of each other. And then the rest of chapter 5 is going to explain what this is all about. So, beginning in verse 5, let me stop and see first if you have any questions about these four signs that Ezekiel gives before we take a look at the rest of chapter 5. Any comments?
Ezekiel bread,
Okay.
sprouted bread, comes from this chapter because God tells him to make the bread in this specific way.
Mm-hmm.
You can buy Ezekiel bread in the stores now, or sprouted bread. It's
Uh-huh.
supposed to be better for you for various reasons.
Yeah, I don't know much about it. I have seen it in the display case at Giant Eagle a number of years ago. I've never tried it. Have you? I
Yeah,
have you?
I think it might be a little heavier.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's a lot heavier than plain old white bread.
Uh-huh.
Everything's heavier than white bread, but yeah, I think it has a little more flavor than some breads.
Uh-huh. Do you think it's given that title because it's just using a scripture reference, or do you think the ingredients in it has some similarity to what we find here in the text?
Yeah, I think the ingredients, the idea came from the scripture. And they use sprouted grains, and that's supposed to be better for your digestion. I think the protein content is higher.
Okay.
Um, what do you call that? I think it's better for diabetics because something about the way it digests.
Oh, huh.
But yeah, I think they got the idea from the scripture
Okay.
using a sprouted grain.
Uh-huh. Well, good. That's insightful. You know how sometimes for marketing purposes, uh, a scripture verse or a scripture reference is sometimes put on labels like testaments. You go to they're basically certs, but they have a different wrapper on them that says, oh, these are testaments, so people can see you're a Christian when you pull it out and put a mint into your mouth. But that's interesting. I've never tasted it, the Ezekiel bread. That I'll have to stop
Yeah.
and kind of look at it a little closer.
If it's not called Ezekiel bread, you can it's essentially it's sprouted bread. So some
Okay.
call it sprouted bread and some call it Ezekiel bread.
Huh. Good. Thank you, Brenda. That's insightful. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, what the rest of chapter 5 is basically talking about Israel's covenant with God and their covenant failure. Basically, that's what it's all about. So if you begin here in verse 5, here's the explanation. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations. That's the way we're going to find in the book of Isaiah. When Isaiah calls out all the nations, Jerusalem is right there in the core of it as well. With countries all around Jerusalem, yet in her wickedness she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and not followed my decrees. So, this is what this is all about. These sign acts are representing judgments that are coming because of covenant violation. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: you have been more unruly than the nations around you, and have not followed my decrees or kept my laws. So we've said that 3 times here already in these couple of verses. You have not even conformed to the standards of the nations around you. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations. Because of all your detestable idols, I will do to you what I have never done before and will never do again. There is some flood imagery there. God brings a flood, but he promises never to bring another flood. Therefore, in your midst, fathers will eat their children, and children will eat their fathers. I will inflict punishment on you and will scatter all your survivors to the winds. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your vile images and detestable practices, I myself will withdraw my favor, and I will not look on you with pity or spare you. A third of your people will die of the plague or perish by the famine inside you. A third will fall by the sword outside your walls, and a third I will scatter to the winds and pursue them with drawn sword. There's the division of the hair. There's 3 divisions of the hair of that particular sign. Then my anger will cease, and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. And when I have spent my wrath upon them, interesting terminology, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal. Now, a quick side note here. This really is an ancient Near Eastern way of looking at God and life, that God is specifically out to get them, okay? It goes on, verse 14. It finishes the chapter this way. I will make you a ruin and a reproach among the nations around you in the sight of all who pass by. You will be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and an object of horror to the nations around you when I inflict punishment on you in anger and in wrath, and with stinging rebuke, I, the Lord, have spoken. When I shoot at you with my deadly and destructive arrows of famine, I will shoot to destroy you. I will bring more and more famine upon you and cut off your supply of food. I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will leave you childless. Plague and bloodshed will sweep through you, and I will bring the sword against you. I, the Lord, have spoken. Pretty gruesome end to chapter 5. And what Ezekiel is doing is exploiting multiple nuances of the word law. The Hebrew word for law is mishpat. And basically, it is a description, more than the rituals that are done, of the morals of the people. So if you look at those last 3 points there, judicial acts that create community of tzedakah, which is righteousness. What are the judicial acts that brings about a rightness with people? Secondly, it could also involve standard codes of behavior that are found in the law. And number 3, acts of retributive judgment for violations of acting unrighteously against each other, people turning against each other, taking advantage of each other, using their positions and power all for themselves rather than for the good, common good of the community. So when you look and you do a cross-reference with chapter 5 and Leviticus 26 and 28, and I understand those are heavy chapters and they're long chapters too, you can basically whittle it down to this. Some of the consequences are going to be, number 1, cannibalism, which was mentioned, scattering them from their land, plague or famine. They are going to be subject to the sword. They will be shamed among the other nations. And then even wild animals, they'll be susceptible to attack.
And so you look at verse 10, verse 12, verse 14, and 15 here in chapter 5, you'll see that those are the things that have already been mentioned in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. So remember, why is it repeated? Leviticus is the first giving of the law. Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law before the new nation. That's why it's repeated. That's why it's basically sounds the same. When you read Leviticus and then you read Deuteronomy, you go, I've read this before. Yes, you have, because it's basically a repetition of what had come before. Okay. Okay, last slide here. Israel's covenant and the nations. It seems as though the nations were supposed to look at Israel as a priestly witness to the goodness and holiness of Yahweh, but their actions are actually working opposite. Secondly, the nations, they're even providing a better, higher moral standard than Israel. That's what it says here. You're not even as good as the neighbors around you. Number three, the nations will witness Yahweh's justice through this invasion and exile. And then finally, Israel is going to experience public shame. So we do have a contemporary illustration of this. So yesterday, our president said that he basically wants to make the land of Palestine the Riviera of the Middle East. Whether he realizes this or not, he showed his hand that the ongoing destruction of Palestine and the killing of the Palestinian people is a land grab. It's not for self-defense. It's a land grab. And in grabbing the land and then exiling the Palestinian people out of that land, they're going to take it and then they're going to clean it up and basically build resorts in that area that can be used to make money. Okay. See, this, as painful as it is to say, brings shame on Israel, a lot of shame on Israel, because they're following an extreme right-wing Netanyahu that is taking them down this road. I don't think they realize it, but they're experiencing basically what Ezekiel is describing here. And that is, they are experiencing shame and disgust in the eyes of the rest of the world. And so this book, while it is old and dated and seems irrelevant, does have some parallels throughout history. And so what we're seeing take place here is that there is these moments in time when our leaders lead us down wrong paths that eventually come back to bite us. So does Israel have hope? Yes. If you take the whole of the Torah out of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, there is always a built-in hope that God will restore his people if they will repent of their ways, if they'll do what is right, if they will be just, those type of things. And of course, that's the great covenant hope, not only for the nation of Israel, but for all nations, to do what is right, and God will honor it and bring about healing rather than destruction. So that is the end of really kind of my thoughts here tonight. I'm going to stop our share and bring us all up on screen, see if you have some questions. Okay, hold on. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording at this time.